The man alone offered his shelter to the native girl. The following day, a secret map was found in his cabin. The storm arrived without warning, turning the desert into a battlefield of wind and rain that could kill a man in minutes. Thomas Whitmore pressed his weathered face against the cabin window, watching nature unleash its fury across the barren landscape of New Mexico Territory. Lightning illuminated the endless expanse of sagebrush and red earth, revealing a figure stumbling through the tempest. She moved like a ghost against the elements, her dark hair whipping in the wind, traditional leather dress clinging to her slight frame. Thomas had lived alone in this godforsaken corner of the territory for 3 years, and visitors were rarer than water in August. Yet here was someone fighting for survival in the worst storm he had witnessed since settling here. Without hesitation, he grabbed his coat and lantern, stepping into the chaos. The wind nearly knocked him sideways as he fought his way toward the struggling figure. She collapsed just as he reached her, exhaustion claiming what little strength remained. Thomas lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she felt in his arms, and carried her back to the safety of his humble cabin. Inside, he laid her on his only bed near the stone fireplace, where flames danced and crackled, casting warm shadows across the rough-hewn walls. She was young, maybe 20, with the distinctive features of the local Apache tribes. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and despite her ordeal, she possessed a striking beauty that made Thomas uncomfortable in ways he had forgotten existed. He prepared hot broth from dried beef and wild onions, the same meal that had sustained him through countless lonely nights. As the storm continued its assault outside, he found himself studying her face in the firelight, wondering what circumstances had driven her into such dangerous weather. The Apache rarely traveled alone, especially their women, and never during storms like this. She stirred as dawn broke, her dark eyes opening slowly to meet his concerned gaze. Fear flickered across her features for a moment before she assessed her surroundings and seemed to relax slightly. "You are safe," Thomas said quietly, offering her a cup of the warm broth. "The storm has passed." She accepted the cup with graceful hands, studying him with intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than most. "You helped me. Anyone would have done the same." "No," she replied simply. "Not anyone." Her name was Ayanna, which she explained meant eternal blossom in her language. She had been traveling to find her younger brother, who had disappeared weeks ago while hunting. The tribal elders believed he had been taken by soldiers or settlers, but Ayanna suspected something different. Her brother had always been drawn to the old stories, the legends of hidden Spanish gold that supposedly lay buried somewhere in these territories. Thomas listened as she spoke, noting how she chose her words carefully, as if revealing too much might be dangerous. He understood that feeling. His own reasons for living alone in this desolate place were not something he discussed with strangers. As she regained her strength throughout the morning, Ayanna helped him with small tasks around the cabin. She moved with unconscious grace, her presence somehow making the sparse interior feel less empty. Thomas caught himself watching her more than was proper, drawn to the quiet strength she radiated despite her obvious vulnerability. The cabin suddenly felt different with another person inside. For 3 years, Thomas had grown accustomed to the silence, the solitude that had become both his punishment and his refuge. Now, with Ayanna moving quietly about, preparing a meal from his meager supplies with skills that far surpassed his own crude cooking, he remembered what it meant to share space with another human being. She worked with ingredients he had never thought to combine, creating flavors from his basic provisions that seemed almost magical. Wild herbs she had gathered during their brief walk outside transformed simple beans and dried meat into something that actually tasted like food rather than mere sustenance. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked, genuinely impressed. "My grandmother taught me that food is medicine for both body and spirit," Ayanna replied, stirring the pot over his fire. "A proper meal can heal more than just hunger." As evening approached, Thomas prepared to give her the bed again, planning to sleep on the floor despite his aging bones. But Ayanna insisted they could both fit comfortably if they simply shared the space like family. Her matter-of-fact approach to the arrangement surprised him, though he supposed survival had taught her to be practical about such things. They lay on opposite sides of the small bed, the fire burning low between them and the wall. Thomas stared at the wooden ceiling, acutely aware of her presence beside him. It had been so long since he had been this close to another person that he had forgotten how comforting simple human warmth could be. "Why do you live alone out here?" Ayanna asked quietly in the darkness. Thomas was silent for a long moment, considering how much truth he was willing to share. Sometimes a man needs to disappear for a while, running from something or toward something. Does it matter? It might. But Thomas did not answer, and eventually her breathing grew steady with sleep. He lay awake much longer, disturbed by feelings he thought he had buried along with his former life. Morning brought clear skies and the harsh beauty of the desert landscape stretching endlessly in all directions. Ayanna seemed stronger, more alert, and Thomas knew she would soon continue her search for her brother. The thought of returning to solitude felt heavier than it had in years. As she prepared to leave, Ayanna paused at the door. "You have been kind to me, Thomas Whitmore. If you ever have need, my people will remember this." Something in her tone made him look at her sharply. "How do you know my name? I never told you." She smiled mysteriously. The desert speaks to those who know how to listen. After she left, Thomas felt the familiar weight of loneliness settle around him like an old coat. But something had changed during her brief stay. The cabin felt different now, as if her presence had awakened something that had been sleeping. He found himself looking toward the horizon more often, wondering if she would return. Later that day, while straightening the bed they had shared, his hand brushed against something unusual tucked between the mattress and the wooden frame. His fingers found the edge of what felt like parchment, carefully hidden in a place where it would not be discovered by accident. Thomas pulled out a rolled piece of aged leather tied with a strip of sinew. As he unrolled it, his breath caught in his throat. It was a map, drawn with remarkable detail and precision, showing landmarks he recognized from his years in the territory. But more than that, it showed locations marked with symbols he had seen before during his previous life as a cavalry scout. Spanish symbols. Markers for gold deposits and hidden caches that conquistadors had left behind centuries ago. This was not some crude treasure map drawn by dreamers and fools. This was authentic, created by men who had actually found gold and marked its locations for future recovery. But why had Ayanna hidden it in his cabin? Had she known it was there, or had she placed it there herself? And if she had left it intentionally, what did she expect him to do with it? Thomas studied the map for hours, correlating the landmarks with his knowledge of the surrounding territory. Several of the marked locations were within a few days' travel from his cabin. One in particular, marked with an elaborate cross and Spanish text, appeared to be hidden in a box canyon he had explored during his first year in the territory. The implications were staggering. If authentic, this map could lead to wealth beyond imagination, but it also represented danger. Maps like this had started wars, destroyed friendships, and left trails of bodies across the frontier. Men killed for far less than the promise of Spanish gold. As evening approached, Thomas found himself torn between excitement and suspicion. Had Ayanna's arrival been as coincidental as it seemed? Her knowledge of his name suggested she had known about him before seeking shelter. Perhaps her story about searching for her brother was partially true, but not the whole truth. He spent a sleepless night considering his options. He could ignore the map, pretend he had never found it, and continue his quiet exile. Or he could investigate, knowing that doing so might drag him back into the kind of life he had worked so hard to escape. By morning, curiosity had won. Thomas packed supplies for a week-long journey and saddled his horse. A sturdy Mari named Clara, who had been his only companion during his years of solitude. The marked location was roughly 2 days' ride northeast through terrain that grew increasingly rough and dangerous. The journey took him through landscapes that showcased both the beauty and harshness of the territory. Rolling hills covered with juniper and pinyon gave way to red rock formations that jutted from the earth like ancient monuments. Hawks circled overhead, riding thermal currents with effortless grace, while lizards darted between rocks heated by the relentless sun. On the second day, Thomas found the box canyon marked on the map. It was exactly as depicted, a narrow entrance opening into a hidden valley perhaps 2 miles long and half a mile wide. Ancient cottonwoods grew along a seasonal creek that was now just a series of muddy pools, and the high walls provided shelter from the constant desert winds. According to the map, the treasure was hidden near the far end of the canyon, beneath a distinctive rock formation that resembled a sleeping giant. Thomas rode slowly through the canyon, noting how perfectly hidden it was from outside view. A person could pass within 100 yards of the entrance and never know it existed. The rock formation was exactly where the map indicated, a massive sandstone outcropping that did indeed resemble a reclining human figure when viewed from a certain angle. Thomas dismounted and began searching the area systematically, looking for any sign of disturbance or artificial construction. It took him most of the afternoon to find the cache, hidden beneath a carefully constructed pile of rocks that appeared natural but had actually been arranged to conceal a cavity in the canyon wall. Thomas discovered a metal strongbox that had been wrapped in oiled leather to protect it from moisture and time. The box was heavier than he expected, and his hands trembled slightly as he worked to open the corroded lock with tools from his saddlebags. Inside, he found exactly what the map had promised: Spanish coins, gold nuggets, and jewelry that must have been worth a fortune even in its own time. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of skilled artisans from an era when such things were created to last for centuries. But beneath the treasure, Thomas found something even more valuable: documents written in Spanish. That appeared to be detailed records of mining operations and other cache locations throughout the territory. If he could translate them properly, they might lead to discoveries that would make this initial find seem modest by comparison. As he carefully repacked the strongbox, Thomas heard the sound of approaching horses. His years as a scout had trained him to recognize danger, and every instinct told him that whoever was coming was not friendly. He quickly concealed the box again and moved to a position where he could observe the canyon entrance without being seen. 3 men rode into the canyon, their clothes and equipment marking them as professional treasure hunters rather than casual prospectors. They moved with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going, and Thomas realized with growing alarm that they also had a copy of the map or information derived from it. The leader was a man Thomas recognized from his former life, a ruthless individual named Marcus Doyle who had made a career of finding valuable things that belonged to other people. Doyle had been suspected of murdering claim jumpers and rival treasure hunters, but had never been proven guilty of anything more serious than claim jumping himself. Thomas watched as the 3 men began searching the same area where he had found the cache. They worked efficiently, suggesting they had done this before, and it was only a matter of time before they discovered the hidden strongbox. Once they did, they would realize someone had been there first, and they would begin looking for that person. Moving as quietly as possible, Thomas worked his way back to where he had left Clara. The mare sensed his urgency and remained still as he mounted and began leading her toward the canyon entrance. If he could reach open ground before the treasure hunters realized they were not alone, he might escape without confrontation. But luck was not with him. As he neared the canyon mouth, one of Doyle's men spotted movement and shouted a warning. Thomas heard the distinctive sound of rifles being cocked and knew he had seconds before bullets started flying. He spurred Clara into a full gallop just as the first shots echoed through the canyon. The mare responded magnificently, stretching into the ground-eating stride that had saved Thomas's life more than once during his cavalry days. Behind him, he could hear the treasure hunters mounting their horses in pursuit. The chase that followed tested both Thomas and his horse to their limits. Clara was fast and sure-footed, but she was carrying supplies for a week-long journey while the pursuing horses carried only their riders and weapons. Gradually, the gap between hunter and hunted began to close. Thomas had two advantages. He knew the territory better than his pursuers, and he was riding toward his own cabin where he had additional weapons and supplies. If he could reach home ground, he might be able to turn the tables on his pursuers or at least hold them off until they grew tired of the chase. The race across the desert became a test of endurance and navigation. Thomas pushed Clara hard but not beyond her limits, knowing that a lamed horse would mean death in this remote country. Behind him, Doyle and his men maintained steady pressure, close enough to be dangerous but not close enough for accurate shooting from horseback. As the sun began to set, Thomas could see his cabin in the distance. Clara was breathing hard but still moving strong, her years of carrying him across difficult terrain serving them both well. The pursuers had fallen back slightly, their horses showing more signs of fatigue than his hardy mare. But as he approached the cabin, Thomas saw something that made his blood run cold. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and there was a horse tied to the hitching post he had built beside his front door. Someone was inside his cabin, and given the timing, it was unlikely to be a friendly visitor. Thomas dismounted behind a low ridge perhaps 200 yards from the cabin and pulled his rifle from its scabbard. Using his spyglass, he could see movement inside through the single window. Someone was definitely there, apparently making themselves at home in his absence. The sound of approaching horses reminded him that Doyle and his men were still pursuing him. Thomas was caught between unknown occupants of his cabin and known enemies approaching from behind. The situation was rapidly becoming untenable. Then the cabin door opened, and Ayanna stepped outside. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and confusion as he watched her scan the surrounding landscape. She appeared to be looking for something or someone, and her posture suggested alertness rather than casual waiting. She raised her hand to her mouth and made a sound that carried clearly across the desert air. It was not quite a bird call, but close enough that anyone not familiar with such things might mistake it for one. Thomas recognized it as a signal, though he did not know what it meant. Behind him, the sound of pursuing horses had stopped. Thomas risked a glance over his shoulder and saw that Doyle and his men had halted their approach. They appeared to be conferring among themselves as if the signal had meaning for them as well. Thomas made a decision that went against every tactical instinct he possessed. He stood up, making himself visible, and walked openly toward his cabin. If Ayanna was connected to his pursuers, he was walking into a trap. If she was not, she might be his only hope of survival. She watched him approach with an expression he could not read. As he drew closer, Thomas could see that she appeared calm and composed, not like someone who had been waiting anxiously for his return. Her horse was saddled and ready for travel, suggesting she had not planned to stay long. "You found it," she said simply as he reached the cabin. "You knew I would. I hoped you would." Thomas glanced back toward the ridge where he knew Doyle and his men were waiting. "Those men following me, they are not friends. I know who they are." "Then you know they will kill us both for what I found." Ayanna smiled, and for the first time since meeting her, Thomas saw something dangerous in her expression. "They can try." Before he could ask what she meant, 3 Apache warriors emerged from concealment around the cabin. They had been positioned so skillfully that Thomas, despite his scouting experience, had not detected their presence. Each warrior was armed with both traditional weapons and modern rifles, and their faces showed the calm determination of men prepared for battle. "My brother and his friends," Ayanna explained. "They have been tracking the men who have been robbing Apache burial sites and sacred places. Doyle is known to us." Thomas began to understand the larger situation. The treasure map had not been hidden accidentally in his cabin. Ayanna had placed it there deliberately, knowing he would find it and hoping he would investigate. The Apache had been using him as bait to draw Doyle and his men into a position where they could be confronted. "So your brother was never missing." "He was missing from where he was supposed to be," Ayanna replied with a slight smile. "But he was exactly where he needed to be." The sound of approaching horses indicated that Doyle had decided to force the issue rather than retreat. Thomas counted at least 6 riders now, meaning the original 3 had been joined by additional men. The odds were becoming more even, but the situation was still dangerous for everyone involved. "Can we avoid a fight?" Thomas asked. "That depends on them," one of the Apache warriors replied in accented English. He was older than the others, with scars that spoke of considerable combat experience. "We want only to recover what was stolen from our people and ensure these thieves do not return to our lands." Doyle and his enlarged group approached the cabin cautiously, clearly aware they were outnumbered and outpositioned. The treasure hunter was experienced enough to recognize a well-planned ambush when he saw one, but he was also greedy enough to risk considerable danger for a significant payoff. "Whitmore," Doyle called out when he was within speaking distance, "you have something that belongs to us." "I found it on my own land," Thomas replied, though he knew the claim was legally questionable. "You found it using our map. The map was in my cabin." "Because we put it there." Thomas glanced at Ayanna, who shook her head slightly. The politics of the situation were more complex than he had realized, with multiple parties claiming ownership of both the map and its treasures. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with both sides calculating odds and alternatives. Finally, the eldest Apache warrior stepped forward. "The gold and silver you seek was stolen from our ancestors by Spanish conquistadors," he said clearly. "It was never yours to claim. We offer you this choice. Leave our lands now and never return, or face the consequences of trespassing and theft." Doyle laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You have no legal claim to anything, Indian. This is American territory now. Legal claim is made by those strong enough to enforce it." The situation was rapidly approaching violence, and Thomas knew that once shooting started, people on both sides would die. He had lived alone for 3 years to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation, but circumstances had drawn him back into conflict despite his best efforts to remain uninvolved. "There is another option," Thomas said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The treasure I found is significant, but according to the documents with it, there are much larger caches still hidden. Instead of fighting over one strongbox, we could work together to find them all." It was a desperate gamble, but Thomas hoped greed might overcome hostility long enough to prevent bloodshed. He was not particularly concerned about Doyle and his men, but he did not want to be responsible for Apache deaths, especially when Ayanna had shown him kindness during his loneliest period in years. Doyle considered the proposal, his eyes calculating potential profits versus certain risks. "What kind of partnership are you suggesting?" "Equal shares based on contribution." "I have the documents that lead to other sites." "You have manpower and equipment." "They have knowledge of the territory and legitimacy with local tribes." The Apache warriors conferred quietly among themselves in their own language while Doyle discussed the proposal with his men. Thomas used the time to study both groups, trying to assess the likelihood that any agreement would last long enough to matter. Ayanna moved closer to him and spoke quietly. "This is dangerous for you. Once they have what they need, they will not honor any agreement." "I know," Thomas replied, "but it gives us time to plan for that." "Us?" Thomas looked at her seriously. "If you will have me as a partner, I would like to help you and your people recover what is rightfully yours." She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine his sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "Then we worked together." The temporary alliance that emerged from the standoff was fragile and distrustful, but it provided a framework for avoiding immediate violence. Doyle and his men would contribute labor and equipment. The Apache would provide territorial knowledge and legitimacy, and Thomas would guide them using the Spanish documents he had discovered. The first joint expedition took them to a location nearly a week's ride from Thomas's cabin, deep into mountainous country that few white settlers had ever seen. The Spanish documents described a mining operation that had been abandoned suddenly, leaving behind not only processed gold and silver, but also tools and equipment that might have historical value. Travel with such a diverse and mutually suspicious group proved challenging. Doyle's men were professional treasure hunters accustomed to taking what they wanted by force, while the Apache warriors were defending their homeland against people they considered invaders and thieves. Thomas found himself serving as interpreter and mediator, trying to prevent misunderstandings from escalating into violence. Ayanna proved invaluable during the journey. Her knowledge of the landscape and weather patterns helped them avoid dangerous areas and find the best routes through difficult terrain. More importantly, her presence seemed to reassure both sides that their temporary alliance had legitimate purpose beyond mere opportunism. On the fourth day of travel, they reached the location described in the Spanish documents. It was a hidden valley accessible only through a narrow defile that could easily be defended by a few determined individuals. Ancient mining equipment still lay scattered around the site, and the entrances to several mine shafts were visible in the rocky walls of the valley. The Spanish miners had indeed left in haste. Personal belongings were scattered throughout what remained of their camp, and one of the mine shafts contained a cache of processed silver that must have represented months of labor. More importantly, they found additional documents that described the complete network of Spanish mining operations throughout the region. But the discovery also revealed the scope of the challenges they faced. The Spanish had not abandoned the site voluntarily. Evidence suggested they had been attacked and driven away, possibly by Apache ancestors defending their territory. Human remains found in one of the collapsed mine shafts indicated that some of the miners had died violently. The Apache warriors examined the site with obvious emotional complexity. This place represented both stolen wealth taken from their lands and a historical victory by their people against foreign invaders. Their reaction to sharing the discovery with white treasure hunters was understandably conflicted. Doyle and his men showed no such sensitivity. They immediately began calculating the value of what they had found and planning how to extract it most efficiently. Their excitement over the discovery made them careless about concealing their true intentions regarding their Apache and settler partners. Thomas recognized the signs of impending betrayal and began making his own plans. The temporary alliance had served its purpose by leading them to significant treasure, but it would not survive the reality of dividing that treasure among parties with fundamentally different goals and values. On their last night at the mining site, as they prepared to return to civilization with their initial finds, Thomas approached Ayanna away from the others. "They planned to kill us once we reach safer territory," he said quietly. "I know. My people are ready. What about the future? Even if we survive this, there will be others like Doyle. The documents we found describe treasures worth more than most men see in a lifetime. Word will spread." Ayanna considered his question carefully. "My people have protected these lands for generations. We will continue to do so, but now the secrets are out. Maps and documents will be copied and sold. Every treasure hunter in the territory will come looking. Then we must ensure they find nothing." Thomas understood her meaning. The Apache intended to destroy or hide all evidence of the remaining treasure sites rather than allow them to attract more intruders to their lands. It was a logical strategy, but it meant giving up potential wealth that could have improved many lives. "There might be another way," Thomas suggested. "What if the treasures were recovered legally through proper channels, with compensation paid to the Apache for the use of their lands? The territorial government is always looking for sources of revenue, and they might be willing to negotiate an agreement that benefits everyone. You would trust the American government to honor such an agreement?" Thomas had to admit that his confidence in governmental integrity was limited. It would be better than endless cycles of treasure hunters and violence. Their conversation was interrupted by sounds of disagreement from the main camp. Doyle and his men were arguing with the Apache warriors about how to transport the silver they had recovered. The treasure hunters wanted to pack it all on their horses and move quickly toward the nearest town, while the Apache insisted on taking time to properly conceal their route and destination. Thomas recognized the argument as a pretext for the confrontation both sides expected. Neither group trusted the other enough to travel together much longer, and the stress of guarding valuable cargo while moving through dangerous territory was making everyone nervous and trigger-happy. "It is time to separate," Ayanna observed. "Agreed, but we need to do it safely." The solution they arrived at satisfied no one completely, but avoided immediate violence. The Apache would take half the recovered treasure and travel by their own routes back to their territory. Doyle and his men would take the other half and head toward the territorial capital, where they could convert their find into cash through established channels. Thomas faced a choice between the two groups, knowing that his decision would likely determine his fate. Doyle had made it clear that anyone who did not travel with his group would be considered an enemy who knew too much about their business. The Apache had made no explicit threats, but Thomas understood that remaining on their lands without permission would also be dangerous. But Ayanna solved his dilemma with a proposal that surprised everyone. "Thomas Whitmore knows these lands and speaks both languages. He should carry word of our agreement to the territorial authorities so that future disputes can be avoided through legal means rather than violence." It was a diplomatic solution that gave Thomas a legitimate reason to separate from both groups while serving a useful purpose. Doyle could not object without appearing to oppose legal resolution of territorial disputes, and the Apache could present him as their authorized representative in any future negotiations. The next morning, the three parties separated with wary farewells and mutual promises to honor their temporary agreement. Thomas suspected he would never see any of them again, which was probably for the best given the underlying tensions that had never been fully resolved. He rode toward the territorial capital alone, carrying copies of the most important Spanish documents and a written statement from the Apache, explaining their position regarding treasure hunting on their lands. Whether anything would come of his diplomatic mission remained to be seen, but at least he had avoided being shot by either side in their inevitable future confrontations. The journey gave him time to reflect on everything that had happened since Ayanna first appeared at his cabin during the storm. In the space of a few weeks, his quiet exile had been completely disrupted, and he found himself once again involved in exactly the kind of conflicts and complications he had worked so hard to avoid. But he also realized that his years of solitude had not brought him the peace he had sought. Loneliness and isolation were poor substitutes for purpose and human connection, even when those connections involved danger and uncertainty. Meeting Ayanna had reminded him that some things were worth the risk of getting hurt again. As he approached the outskirts of Santa Fe, Thomas made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Instead of returning to his remote cabin after completing his diplomatic mission, he would find a way to remain involved in resolving the territorial disputes that the treasure discoveries had created. The territorial governor received him with polite skepticism, but the Spanish documents and Apache statement provided concrete evidence of problems that would only grow worse if ignored. Thomas found himself appointed as an unofficial mediator, tasked with developing policies that would balance the legitimate interests of treasure hunters, territorial settlers, and native tribes. It was not the kind of work he had ever imagined doing, but it combined his knowledge of the territory with his experience in dealing with different groups of people under difficult circumstances. More importantly, it gave him a reason to stay involved with the issues that had brought Ayanna into his life. 6 months later, Thomas was still living in Santa Fe, working with territorial officials to establish guidelines for treasure hunting and archaeological research that respected native rights while allowing legitimate economic development. The work was slow and often frustrating, but it was progress toward solutions that might prevent future conflicts like the one he had witnessed. One day, as he was reviewing maps of disputed territories in his small office, Thomas looked up to find Ayanna standing in his doorway. She appeared exactly as he remembered her, but there was a new confidence in her bearing that suggested the intervening months had been kind to her. "I heard you were still working on our problems," she said with a slight smile he remembered so well. "Someone has to. And how is the progress?" "Slow, but real. Your people now have legal standing in territorial courts, and treasure hunters must obtain permits that include compensation for native tribes. It is not perfect, but it is better than what we had." Ayanna nodded approvingly. "My grandfather says you are a man who keeps his word. I try to be." She moved into his office and examined the maps and documents covering his desk. "There is something else I should tell you about that night I stayed in your cabin." Thomas felt his pulse quicken slightly. "What is that?" "The map was not the only thing I left behind." She reached into a leather pouch and pulled out a small object wrapped in soft cloth. When she unwrapped it, Thomas saw a beautifully crafted silver pendant in the shape of an eagle, clearly of Spanish origin and probably quite valuable. "I found this in the first cache, the one you discovered. I kept it because I thought it might be important later, but I wanted you to have it as a reminder of what we accomplished together." Thomas accepted the pendant, surprised by how much the gesture meant to him. "It is beautiful. It is also historically significant. The Spanish records you translated describe it as belonging to the leader of the mining expedition. It represents not just treasure, but the meeting of cultures that shaped this territory." They stood together looking at the pendant, both aware that it symbolized more than just their shared adventure. It represented the possibility that people from different backgrounds could work together toward common goals, even when those goals required overcoming significant obstacles and suspicions. "What are your plans now?" Thomas asked. "My people want me to work with the territorial government as an official representative. It seems I have developed a reputation as someone who can negotiate with Americans without losing sight of Apache interests. That would mean staying in Santa Fe. For part of the time, yes." Thomas felt something he had not experienced in years. Hope for a future that included another person. "Would you like to have dinner tonight? I know a place that serves food almost as good as what you cooked in my cabin." Ayanna laughed, and the sound filled his small office with warmth. "I would like that very much." As they walked together through the streets of Santa Fe that evening, Thomas realized that his life had taken a direction he never could have predicted when he first decided to live alone in the desert. The solitude that had once seemed necessary for his survival had given way to connections and responsibilities that made survival seem less important than living well. The story that had begun with a storm and a stranger seeking shelter had evolved into something much larger and more meaningful. Two people from different worlds had found common ground, not just in their shared adventure, but in their commitment to building a better future for the territory they both called home. The evening air carried the scent of pinon smoke and cooking food, familiar smells that now represented not loneliness, but community. Thomas and Ayanna walked together toward an uncertain but hopeful future, their partnership proven by challenges overcome and their commitment to each other strengthened by shared purpose. Behind them, the sun set over the mountains that held countless secrets yet to be discovered, but also countless opportunities for people willing to work together toward common goals. The Old West was changing, and they had helped shape that change in ways that honored both progress and tradition. The treasure map that had started their adventure now hung framed in Thomas's office, not as a guide to hidden gold, but as a reminder that the greatest discoveries often came from unexpected partnerships and the courage to trust strangers who might become friends.